Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's March 28th, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. First topic, Shakespeare. There's something in England called the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, or SBT. It was founded in 1847, and it holds one of the world's most extensive and important archives of Shakespeare memorabilia, much of it donated by Shakespeare enthusiasts. And it has turned the site of New Place, the house that Shakespeare bought in 1597, into a museum about Stratford and its favorite son. So Shakespeare was born and died in Stratford upon Avon in central England. And if you thought that something like the SBT would exist to praise Shakespeare and to uphold his legacy as one of, if not the greatest writers in the history of the English language, well, you would be correct up until the past few years. Because in 2022, the SBT asked Helen Hopkins, a postgraduate researcher at Birmingham City University, who had inspected the Trust's archives for her doctoral thesis, to draw up an indictment of Shakespeare. And her mission was to, quote, recognize the role Shakespeare has been forced to play in establishing and upholding imperialistic narratives of cultural supremacy. And so as part of this project, there's a research project undertaken by Ms. Hopkins and the Trust, a joint effort, and that one of the core theses of that project is that to venerate Shakespeare is to support, quote, white, Anglo-centric, Eurocentric, and increasingly West-centric views that continue to do harm in the world today. The idea of Shakespeare's universal genius benefits, quote, the ideology of white European supremacy and the, quote, racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise harmful material in the SBT's collections commits, quote, epistemic violence, which I guess is a fancy way of saying rude or mean words. And it might be tempting to write this off as frivolous, as something that should just be ignored and treated as something that they're, just attention grabbing, isolated. But the fact that this is the SBT, which is the organization in England that has control over Shakespeare's birthplace, and in a large part has a big impact on his legacy, and tons of people come and visit this location. And so the fact that, again, an organization that ostensibly would be guarding his legacy is instead denigrating it, I think is a big deal. And he's the most famous writer in the English language for good reason. The works are still relevant today. There's still a lot to apply to 2025. And then many phrases that we take for granted in the English language, many idioms, come from Shakespeare. And Shakespeare indeed has had a global impact. There's many Indian writers have written about Shakespeare. There have been Japanese films adapting Shakespeare plays. I mean, he really is not just part of the Western canon. He is a worldwide phenomenon. And so in a minute I'm going to throw it to Ness, but what I'd like to grapple with is how this can happen when you have England lays claim to the greatest writer in the history of the English language, and arguably the most famous writer of any language in the history of the world. They have that legacy, and they have this gift or this legacy, and what they choose to do with it is denigrate it, is willingly to tear it down, to destroy it. I think it's really something pathological. I'm unaware of any other racial group besides white people who do things like that, who tear down their ancestors. And I don't know what exactly the motivation, what accounts for that. Is it just simply white guilt? What do you think, Ness?
This is a prime example of Robert Conquest's second law in action, that anything that is not explicitly right-wing and traditional and concerned about preserving the conventional reasons for an organization's existence in the modern world inevitably leans leftward and towards entropy and towards self-destruction and convergence towards the broader cultural zeitgeist, which in the modern world, in the modern Western world, is self-deprecating and embarrassed of any sort of claim to a cultural or ethnic or linguistic heritage that is anything more than just a set of propositions. And those propositions tend to be self-flagellating in the Western world. I don't want to be conceited enough to assert that I have some answer that is particularly insightful. I would imagine it's a confluence of factors. One of them, I think, is biological in nature. I think it has to do with Western Europeans, and particularly Northwestern Europeans, being among the most outbred population on the planet. Outbred means the opposite of inbred. It means that there tends to be large distances, genetic distances among Europeans through time. An easier way to understand that is that people of Northwestern European descent tend to be the least clannish. Things like cousin marriage, which is something that will immediately invoke a sense of disgust in most modern Westerners, is something that is still the norm in much of the world. In the Middle East and Iraq, as of 2001, when the United States invaded Iraq, consanguinity rates in Iraq were at about 50%. So about 50% of the marriages and subsequent offspring from marriages in Iraq in the 21st century, about 50% were between people who were second cousins or closer. And that outbreeding, which is not the norm historically at all, it's not the norm anywhere in the world. Moderners without a good grasp of history might recognize references to it in popular series like Game of Thrones, but close intermarriage among members of the same extended families was commonplace in antiquity in Europe. The Bible is full of references to it. All ancient religious texts are. Perhaps the most well-known period of antiquity that survives in the modern consciousness, modern popular consciousness today, is first century BC and AD Rome with Julius Caesar and Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and the Cleopatra and the Ptolemy dynasty that Cleopatra came from had gone back 7 generations, where the ruling sister and brother pair had produced offspring. And that is a pattern that has existed throughout virtually all of known recorded history, and really was only broken by the Catholic Church in the 5th and 6th and onward centuries in Western Europe, such that now people of Northwestern European descent are by far the most outbred populations in the world, and they tend to that tends to create systems where people have a more universalistic, more meritocratic orientation and a less clannish and less nepotistic orientation. And that sense of universalism, coupled with the outsized achievements of people of Northwestern European descent, as was documented in Charles Murray's book Human Accomplishment, something like 98% of the most monumental discoveries in the liberal arts and in science and in mathematics were men of Northwestern European descent, specifically people to the west of the Haginal Line, which are in places like Germany and the UK and Switzerland, Sweden. And these are the most outbred places even within Europe, which is far more outbred than the rest of the world is. To put that consanguinity rate of the modern Middle East in context, in the 18th and 19th centuries in Appalachia, the most backwater parts of America, where the stereotypes about inbred hillbillies still have some purchase today. In Kentucky and in Western Tennessee, it's estimated that during, again, the 18th and 19th centuries, that about 20% of marriages and reproduction in those areas were consanguineous, that is, second cousin or closer. So in the 21st century in Iraq, 1 in 2 marriages are between second cousins or closer. In the hillbilly backcountry of early America, just 1 in 5 were, to put it in context, and to see how different the Northwestern European population and its diaspora, of which America, especially its founding stock, predominantly was, how different that is than so much of the rest of the world still today, let alone in the past.
I agree with that, Ness. I think that has a lot to do with what we're seeing today, when a country like Great Britain would knowingly denigrate and tear down their greatest writer. My question is, the outbreeding rate you mentioned started going. Europe became much more outbred beginning in the 6th and 5th centuries, due largely to the Catholic Church. But that leaves roughly 1,500 years ago, when Europe started to become much more outbred, and yet this strain of self-hatred and self-flagellation really, I think, only began in earnest maybe 100 years ago in the West. So why do you think it's happening now? Why was there such self-confidence and I would say certainly lack of self-hatred? I would say the opposite for much of the Enlightenment period up until perhaps the onset of World War I. There was a sense of confidence among people of European heritage.
I'm going to go back to the quibbling that I did last week and take a bit of an issue with the term. I don't know if I would call it self-hatred per se, because I don't think, say, this woman who is tearing down the Shakespeare Foundation actually hates herself. I think there is a lot of status signaling and status climbing that is tied up in all of this. After all, she did her dissertation on it, so this was clearly to advance her own career. In the same sense, we could say that Galileo was criticizing the culture at the time when he had his run-in with the Catholic Church, but I wouldn't classify Galileo as self-hating. But more broadly, I think that the way that this outbreeding affects how much resonance, self-criticism, and a critical outlook, or a critical inward look, that susceptibility is there, but it still has to be rewarded in the broader culture for it to take effect, take hold of the population. In other words, I think outbreeding creates a situation where it is possible for self-criticism to be kicked into overdrive if the culture rewards it in a way that I don't think now would be even potentially realizable in the Middle East or in Africa or in Asia. There's no guarantee that Europeans are going to hate themselves and their culture, but there is the potential for it. A potential that is almost unique among the major racial populations on the globe. I don't think that there is really potential for that sort of self-hatred in Africa or among Amerindians or East Asians or South Asians or even more inbred Central and Eastern Europeans. I think it is a distinct Northwestern European trait, the tendency for that. And we can get into other more tribalistic groups that might be able to find that susceptibility and exploit it in ways that are quite pathological for the host Northwestern European population, if we really want to push on some modern taboos. But I don't want to cause too big of a digression, so we will avert that for now. As an aside, as far as why the Catholic Church pushed so hard against cousin marriage, the secular, irreligious explanation is that the Catholic Church was concerned about amassing resources for itself. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church owned between 20 and 40%, varying depending on region, of land in Europe. And at the time, of course, land was the primary source of wealth prior to the Industrial Revolution, during the days of economics being primarily driven by agrarian concerns, having control of 1/5 to almost half of the resource producing land of the realm was, in a very secular and arguably spiritual sense, beneficial for the church's mission. As far as how encouraging outmarriage promotes that, it's by taking wealthy landed estates, and instead of having them marry one another, they marry outward, thereby breaking that family dynastic hold of large tracts of productive land over time. And apropos our subject here with Shakespeare, the late Samuel Huntington, remarking on this change, this move away from inbreeding and towards more outbreeding among Western European populations, the, quote, Romeo and Juliet revolution, unquote. Europeans became increasingly sympathetic toward the right of young women to marry men that they love, and a corresponding cultural pushback against the arranged marriages that underpin consanguinity in so much of the rest of the world. As far as the cultural dynamic, the current zeitgeist that we're in, where this sort of, especially in 2021, 2022, in the wake of the great martyr George Floyd, the cultural rewards for that criticism and the tearing down, the deracination of European cultural and religious traditions, the attractiveness that that has to so many people today would not be something wholly alien to Shakespeare. This is a dynamic that happens a lot when people of more traditional, conventional orientation look back at people in the past, people who were pioneers or lodestones of culture in the past, and imagine that, well, if so-and-so could only see what was happening today, he would be turning over in his grave. But the reality is that Shakespeare was very much a leftist at the time. He was a irreverent libertine pushing the cultural envelope in so many different ways, as often the artistic types are. His plays dealt with interracial relationships, with criticisms of traditional chivalric culture and of Christianity, and were full of cross-dressing and involved things like homosexuality. There were all kinds of cultural envelope pushing things that Shakespeare explored in a sympathetic and often endearing way. If he were alive today and he were able to remove his own accomplishments from consideration and was just a modern, if Shakespeare was put into Western Europe or the United States in 2025, it is highly unlikely that he would be defending conventional Shakespeare veneration, but he would be more likely to be on the same side as our esteemed Helen Hopkins, who was the one Jeff alluded to earlier that wrote the dissertation talking about the cultural supremacy and imperialism that Shakespeare represented. On the cultural front, this is what virtually always happens. The cultural envelope pushing revolutionaries eat their own and eat the legacies of their own.
The timing of this is important. This project apparently began when the SBD, the trust, hired this lady, Helen Hopkins, to do this project. It was 2022, and that was during the height of the post-George Floyd hysteria, anti-whites, anti-Western zeitgeist was in the air. And so this kind of thing was in high demand. Versus, I would argue, in 2025, something like this would have a harder time getting green-lighted. And that explains why there has been SBT has been less than forthcoming in response to inquiries about further details about this project. They've been sort of not being forthcoming And so I think they're reacting to the bit of the backlash that has, the anti-woke backlash that has, that was largely in a large part responsible for Trump being elected. And so there is a shift against this kind of thing. How long-lasting that will be remains to be seen.
I'm pessimistic on that front. It's pretty standard fare for these things for the ratchet to be pushed 4 or 5 notches in one direction, and then there be a bit of an overshooting and a self-correction where there is some backlash, some pushback that takes it back 1 notch from the 4 or 5 notches that it had moved previously. I think we can see this pretty clearly in data for support for the Black Lives Matter movement, which has taken probably more than any other entity or any other focal point, has come under criticism in the pushback that Jeff was referencing. And support for Black Lives Matter, the movement, is indeed lower now than it was at its peak in 2021, but it is still higher than it was when Black Lives Matter came into existence following the death of Michael Brown in 2013. So we're about at 2017 or 2018 levels of support for Black Lives Matter, and I think that's a pretty good proxy for where the culture is with regards to wokeness or anti-white racial vengeance, however you want to characterize the cultural Marxism, however you want to characterize the zeitgeist that was at its local height in 2020, 2021. And Jeff pointed out that Michael Brown was 2014, not 2013. My fault on misremembering that. And to come back to the point about the Cultural Revolution eating its own, it is a very useful tool in the toolkit of the transgressive cultural vanguard. By projecting back modern sensibilities on past events and past institutions, past cultural figures, it grants the ability to take down anything and everything from the past as it's deemed necessary to do, and as it presents rewards for those who are doing the tearing down in the present. So even someone who was a leftist and a cultural libertine of the time, like Shakespeare, by modern sensibilities looks like a totally retrograde, hidebound, racist and sexist and homophobe and any other kind of derogatory remark that can be made to damage the modern contemporary perception of a figure like Shakespeare. We see the same thing with slave owning, particularly in the context of the United States, where even people who were very much progressive and culturally transgressive for their time, like someone, say, like Thomas Jefferson, still comes in for damning criticism by modern sensibilities. And we are not, I suspect, immune from that same sort of dynamic playing out. Imagine, say, in 50 or 100 years, we get to a point where lab-made meat is every bit as tasty and nutritious as current grass-fed livestock meat is. And so it becomes morally as unconscionable to eat a hamburger made from a steer on a ranch as it is to butcher, say, a dog today. We could certainly, it's not hard to imagine a situation 50 or 100 years in the future where that is the case. And then we could conceive of a situation where Helen Hopkins of 2070 is talking about how Barack Obama was a purveyor of speciesism and a normalizer of carnivorous, anthropomorphic, problematic cultural supremacy or something to that effect. Because just like 300 years ago, people either owned slaves or at least perceived it to be culturally acceptable. So today, almost everyone either eats meat or perceives that it is culturally acceptable to do so. But it's not difficult to imagine where the culture shifts dramatically over the next 50 or 100 years and thereby renders everyone or virtually everyone alive today potentially susceptible to this cultural erasing and cultural degradation if it suits the people in the future to culturally denigrate those figures, even if those figures were at the time considered progressive and transgressive and forward-thinking and all of the other things that tend to be perceived favorably by the cultural shaping institutions.
All right, next topic is polling data regarding how various generations of Americans feel towards Donald Trump. So you looked into the polling data, Ness. What'd you find?
A really staggering shift in generational cohort support for Trump from 2016 to 2024. YouGov Economist has done detailed polling over that entire period of time, and the outfit breaks responses down by age ranges. For the sake of audible flow, I'm going to refer to those under the age of 30 as Zoomers, those between the ages of 31 and 44 as Millennials, those between the ages of 45 and 64 as Gen Xers, and those 65 and older as Boomers, even though in 2016, those under the age of 30 would be predominantly Millennials. There would be some older Zoomers, but a lot of the Zoomers who were old enough to vote in 2024 would not have been old enough to vote in 2016. But with that caveat out of the way, on the eve of the 2016 presidential election, Zoomers, those under the age of 30, had a net negative favorability of Donald Trump of 55. So that's taking the percentages who view him favorably and subtracting from that the percentages who viewed him unfavorably, a negative 55. In 2024, that same age cohort has just a negative 4 net favorability rating of Donald Trump. That's a shift, a delta of plus 51 points over an 8-year period, which is electorally truly staggering. That is a seismic shift in the political landscape. Among millennials in 2016, Trump had a net favorability of negative 33. That shifted to just negative 9 in 2024. So Trump became 24 points better among millennials. Among Xers in 2016, it was a negative 18. By 2024, it was a positive 6, and that represented a similar 24-point swing in Trump's favor over that intervening 8 years. Only among Boomers has Trump's support declined over the period of time from when he first came onto the political scene to once he had become an established part of it. In 2016, Trump had a plus 5 net favorability among Boomers, whereas today in 2024, he has just a plus 1 net favorability among Boomers, which represents a change in the negative direction of 4 points. As for what accounts for this, there are many, many factors that I would not deem to be able to articulate accurately. But I think some of the major reasons, one I just alluded to, was the acceptance of Trump as and the MAGA movement as part of the American landscape, political landscape and cultural landscape in a way that it really wasn't in 2016. There was still the hard push of like an immune system under attack to try to expel Trump and MAGA and everything that was associated with that. And that is just no longer the case. It is now largely acceptable. And we've talked about that in previous episodes, the reasons for that. The primary reason, from my perspective, is that a faction of elite cultural, institutional, economically powerful movers and shakers got behind Trump. But whatever the reasons for that acceptance taking hold, it clearly has taken hold now. And the hysteria that led hundreds of thousands of women and male allies to take to the streets in the Harvey marches of early 2017. There is too much cultural acceptance, resignation, granted, among many people, but acceptance still, that it makes an outpouring of opposition to an election, to Trump's second election, just much less likely than was the case in 2016, and would have been the case, I suspect, too, in 2020 had he won again. I think the shift has predominantly occurred between 2020 and 2024, more so than between 2016 and 2020. And really, I would peg it at the latter part of that 2020 to 2024 range, more like 2022 2023 into 2025. I think that is when the significant shift of Trump acceptance occurred, such that a regional bank president being identified as a donor and supporter of Donald Trump's campaign in 2024 would not have consequential negative ramifications, at least not anything like would have been the case in 2020 or 2016, when it could lead to the board causing him to resign or run out of town. I don't think that is the case anymore. And I think a lot of that, again, has to do with the fact that there are Bill Ackmans and David Sacks and Elon Musks that are putting their money and their support behind Donald Trump, such that it is acceptable for leaders and cultural shapers to back Trump and to embrace the MAGA movement.
A few things that might help explain this positive shift towards Trump. Ness mentioned the sort of a normalization of Trump, and I think that's the case, and that could explain Zoomers, especially Gen Z, because they grew up more or less with Trump part of the zeitgeist, him as a political figure kind of being taken for granted. So they didn't have as much context to appreciate how radically different Trump was and how many of the norms he broke. And so it's more just they're used to it, versus millennials grew up during the W. Bush and Obama years, and that was kind of their, at least in terms of style, that was their reference point. Very buttoned up, proper, professional, versus then to have Trump come in when they were, young adults. It was shocking, and Trump was vulgar and kind of offensive to them.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, and it kind of got mixed up, or it might have gotten jumbled up when I was going through the numbers, because I was talking about the changes and the fact that Zoomers have shifted the most. But if we look at just in 2025, the net favorability by generational cohort for Trump, Xers are at the top with a +6 net favorability, followed by Boomers at a +1, and then Zoomers at -4, and finally Millennials at -9. So Zoomers have a higher favorability of Trump than Millennials do. And so I think that explanation is perfectly perspicacious, because I think that nails it exactly right. It is out of the ordinary for that sort of generational trend to manifest like it does here. And it's a full 5 points, which is with outside of statistical insignificance. I mean, that there is a real difference, and that is even on top of the fact that demographically the Zoomers are less white, and whites still are Trump's biggest support base. And so when you account for the racial differences, the generational gap is even larger, with Zoomers being significantly more favorably inclined towards Trump than millennials are. And I think why they accept it in a way that is hard for millennials, that you said, is exactly right.
Something we mentioned before, too, is the economy. People, during the Biden years, the economy was the inflation was horrible, and people had that memory just a few years previously of Trump, when the economy was at least perceived to be quite good, other than during COVID. But I think people kind of give Trump a pass on COVID. They don't blame him for all the economic havoc that was came during COVID. But during the first 3 years of his term, the economy was, like I said, perceived as doing well. And so after having a good economy under Trump and then a really bad one under Biden, made Trump seem all the more appealing from an economic standpoint. And then more on the style side, there was such a contrast. Even though they're both old white men, there's such a contrast between Trump and Biden, just in terms of vigor and energy. And I think seeing Biden deteriorate in front of our eyes, and then add on top of that being lied to repeatedly by the Democratic Party and the media, which are the same thing, lied to that Biden was actually with it and as sharp as he's ever been. There's also the Joe Rogan effect, where I think that was a huge deal, Joe Rogan endorsing Trump. And then, of course, Elon Musk buying Twitter, and then Elon Musk endorsing Trump. And then, of course, I think the lawfare unleashed against Trump in the wake of the 2021 Capitol riot, I think that backfired in large part. People saw through it, saw it as a witch hunt, as Trump called it. And Trump, again, is a genius at marketing and branding, and that term witch hunt caught on. And I think that's how most people viewed the lawfare unleashed against Trump. So Trump gained some sympathy on that. I think that helps. And then also a huge factor was the two assassination attempts on Trump, but specifically the first one in Butler, Pennsylvania. The bravery and courage that Trump displayed under that, I think, unless even the most diehard people afflicted by Trump derangement syndrome, I think have to begrudgingly acknowledge that he handled that amazingly well. And speaking as a millennial, I can say, unfortunately, the desire to push the envelope and to be edgy that's typically associated with youth was in large part absent from the millennial generation. So that could help explain why typically you would think somebody like Trump, even though he's an old white man, he is really edgy and says things you're not supposed to and constantly breaks taboo. You would think that would appeal to the younger generation. It didn't largely to millennials, but I'd like to think that Gen Z has more of that anti-establishment mentality. So maybe that's helps explain some of the appeal of Trump, but that's complete speculation. I don't know if there's any data to support Gen Z being any more anti-authority, or at least more anti-authority than the millennial generation.
I think the dawn of the internet age ports pretty well onto grasping this as well. Gen X was the generation where the internet was born, and the leading lights of the internet revolution were Xers. And the dream of the internet in the 80s and the 90s was that it was the place where uninhibited free expression could blossom across the entire world without any gatekeepers there to monitor or to squelch it, to censor it in any way. That was what the Xers came into with the internet, and that changed with the millennials and the onset of social media and the social pressures to conform that come along with things like MySpace and then Facebook and Twitter and all of the other social media applications that have come online since then. Jack Dorsey, notably, since we're talking about Twitter, and Twitter gets an understandably bad rap from a free expression perspective, given how Twitter cooperated with the bureaucratic state during the Trump years. But it is worth noting that when Jack Dorsey founded Twitter, he pushed it as the, quote, free speech wing of the free speech movement, unquote. And I think that is where he is a late millennial, early Xer. He's on that border, and I think he encapsulates that viewpoint. I think he's a little more timid than somebody like Elon Musk, who was born in 1971, right in the thick of the Xer generation, and the perfect embodiment of someone who viewed the internet as an open, endless, unrestricted horizon for human thought and expression and the exchange of ideas freely. And so I share Jeff's hopes that the Zoomers will have seen the excesses of the millennials' concern with social conformity and be able to revive some of the dream that the Xers had for that free and open internet and revive it. Jeff mentioned Joe Rogan there, and I should note, too, that Joe Rogan was born in 1967, so that would make him an early Xer as well. All right, that'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.